around that time, most of the people here were sneaking off to Bombay to see Nisargadatta. Like, he was the big thing in those days. So I went off to see him. He would encourage you to speak when you came. There was no hiding at the back. If you were new, you sat 6 feet in front of him and he started harassing you on day one. A little bit polite to begin with. What's your guru? What have you read? What's your practice? He'd make you talk about yourself, so you had to reveal where you were coming from. And then, in a very elegant, forceful way, he was completely uneducated, I think third standard dropout. He would convince you that everything you'd thought, believed and practiced up to that point was a waste of time. I mean, don't ask me how he did it. I mean, there were professors, there were brilliant academics who'd just come in and be totally destroyed by this man. He'd give you this experience. As you were talking to him, he'd demolish everything you thought believed, and then you could see it on people's faces, like, you know, what's true? Is it this experience, or all these ideas I've had all my life? And then they would drop, and you'd accept that the experience he'd given you was the truth, and that all the ideas you'd previously held were worthless and should be thrown out. And he called that moment getting the knowledge. He had a strange vocabulary, but he said, once you've got that knowledge, that's it. Then you're ready for further absorption into the self. And the way he did this was by continuously talking about consciousness, self, and you think, oh my God, not again. I mean, I've heard this 20 times this week, talk about something new. And then suddenly you think, wow, he's not telling me about something, he's describing myself. He just had this amazing power to be the self, to talk the self, and when you weren't looking or paying attention, suddenly you became the self simply by the forcefulness of his explanations. You didn't believe him, you didn't think about it, you listened to him, he got inside you and you became what he was talking about.
So though he called this getting the knowledge, it was actually an experience of self.
He had a little different structure than, say, people like Ramana. There's a level or state he calls consciousness, which is I amness, it's God, it's all kinds of things. And then prior to that, which was his favourite qualification of it, he didn't like to say beyond, he said prior to it there's this thing called awareness. That consciousness comes out of awareness, all manifestation is consciousness and it goes back into awareness. So he had this power to stuff you back into a consciousness in which you weren't bothered by concepts, you just had a very peaceful, quiet sensation. But that for him wasn't the ultimate. This ultimate was the awareness from which the consciousness rose and manifested.
And did you personally experience that?
I doubt it.
Probably you did as you're English. Yeah.
People would come with all the standard spiritual questions, and at the beginning he'd be very polite, he'd listen to them, but often he'd say, I'm not interested in what you've heard, what you've read, I'm only interested in your own direct experience of yourself right now. The rest doesn't matter. So that this immediately would focus the conversation onto something that he considered to be essential. So within this very narrowly prescribed limit, he would let you talk for a little while. And then, after he'd done his number on you, after he'd demolished your beliefs and got you flying, that then he'd introduce a second stipulation. And he'd say, I'm not prepared to answer any questions that assume you're an individual person inside a body. That for me is a totally wrong hypothetical assumption. I'm not going to waste my time answering hypothetical questions. So immediately you had nothing to say. You can't say, how do I get enlightened? Because he'd say, what I? There's no I there. So if you didn't register the implications of the statement and started asking, he just proved to you that every question you could possibly think of assumed there was a you trying to get somewhere. So he said, if you want to talk about consciousness, what it is, how it manifests, how you experience, fine, but don't ask me questions that assume you're a person. I don't accept that premise. So that effectively shut everybody up.
Well, it sounds, whatever, he was obviously a very powerful influence, but then you came back to Ramana Ashram?
Let's think. I stopped going when he got very sick. I didn't really like to see him getting old and die. He had massive throat cancer. I kept having dreams, actually, saying, why don't you come, why don't you come? I remember waking up in the middle of the night one time and thinking, is this just wishful thinking? You know, is this a message from him? Should I go? Dozing back to sleep, and suddenly he appeared. I just told you to come, why don't you believe me? And I wake up again. Somehow I didn't go, I just didn't really feel the urge to go back. I felt satisfied in a way.
You were here in the ashram?
I was here at the time. I mean, the last talk I'd had, there was a sense of completion. We had a very good talk. I think it's actually in Prior to Consciousness. I only found this out last year, about what I understood about Ramana, what I understood about him. He didn't like people hanging around. He liked people to come, get what he had to show them, reveal to them, go away. He had a little room that would take maximum 40 people. So if you tried to hang around, he'd generally kick you out after 10 days and say, you know, new people coming in, last in, first out, whatever it is, and it's your turn to go, you went. But he wouldn't leave me alone. I think all through the 1980s and 90s, he'd keep appearing in my dreams, in a way that no other teacher ever has. Not casual dreams in just everyday situations. It'd always be very, very strong satsang format dreams. I'd be in his room, he'd be giving me some good teachings. I think they went on 10, 15 years after he died. He caught hold of me in some place.
So somehow he was your guru in the form of a guru?
I came here because of Bhagavan in the 70s. I think he became my guru in a sense that his lineage took possession of me. I fell in love with Arunachala, I fell in love with him. I went to see Lakshmana Swami, I fell in love with him, Papaji. All of these people derive their experience, their power, their teachings from that same source, which is somehow very much located here. I was making a book about the way that Bhagavan's power and presence had affected people. Annamalai Swami's book was an outgrowth of that. So somehow the original book got shelved. I wrote a whole book on Annamalai Swami because his story was so good. And when I went to Lucknow to interview Papaji for this same book, the same thing happened. And instead of making one chapter to fit in a book, I ended up writing
several books.
1,500 pages about him. And it took me several years. And I've only just got back to the original project. He wouldn't let me take any notes, he wouldn't let me interrupt. It took about 2 hours. And his final summation, if you like, to give it some relevance, he said, that's the question I should have asked when I was 8, this who am I question. If I'd asked myself who am I once when I was 8, I wouldn't have wasted those next 25 years. And that was like his very roundabout way of answering that question and telling me his life. Then he had to rush off to Hardwar. He came back, I think I had maybe a day and a half. And he just wouldn't give me time. So the morning my train was leaving, after breakfast, I just went up to his bedroom door and banged on the door. And I said, you've got 1 hour. Either we finish this up or it doesn't get written. I don't know when I can come again. I have to be back. I'm not missing this train. I'm leaving in an hour. Take it or leave it, you know.
You said that to Papaji?
Yeah. It's like...
Perhaps you were a little naive in those days.
he appreciated directness. And he said, okay, come in, sit down. And I don't know if you knew his bedroom. He had these 2 single beds, tiny room, absolutely overflowing with stuff that he wouldn't throw away. It was like some weird science fiction movie where every day kind of the walls kind of coming a bit closer. Like he had all these kind of closets lining the walls. He'd have 5 years supply of dried fruit and nuts in one, kind of 10 lifetime supply of doties that people would give him in another. He wouldn't part with any of this stuff. So the cupboards just got deeper and deeper, and the space available to kind of do anything got smaller and smaller. At the centre of which was his bed, and Jyoti, his attendant, had a bed there. So they were crammed so close, there was maybe this much space between the 2 beds. So we sat facing each other. There wasn't room to have knee on knee like this, so we were kind of interlocking, and he'd sort of lean forward like this, so we were kind of eyeball to eyeball, like noses almost touching. It didn't matter if I sort of leaned back a bit, he'd kind of lean forward a bit more. And I started asking, I said, well, you said this, but that doesn't make sense. So all the usual boring journalist clean up the mess questions, of which he had absolutely no interest in answering. He was off on some strange thing about Prakriti, which I didn't understand. But he was kind of looking at me, like totally unblinking, unwavering eyes. And there was a little corner of me that said, pay attention, this is it, you've got 60 minutes to get this guy to spill the beans. If you don't get something sensible out of him, you don't get this chapter written. So there's like one little corner of David the journalist kind of keeping 2 nostrils above the water. And the rest of me was just getting totally blown away. Like he wasn't remotely interested in what he was saying. I think it was just an excuse to keep his mouth moving. It was basically like nose to nose. He was just kind of glaring at me. Finally, I just couldn't hold it together anymore. I couldn't be sensible. I couldn't ask questions. And I thought, well, he doesn't want to answer them, so why even bother? We looked at each other for a while. And I think in that moment, it's like I knew who he was in that moment. And we just sort of sat there, totally quiet, totally blown away. And in the end he said, well, you came here to find out who I was, now you know.